Hello, welcome back. Today we read Chapter 1, The First Son. Freddie's status as the oldest son in the family had gone from protecting him from Fred's worst impulses as a parent to being an immense and stressful burden. As he got older, he became torn between the responsibility that his father had placed on him and his natural inclination to live life his own way. Fred wasn't torn at all. His son should be spending time at the Trump management office on Avenue Q, not with his friends out on Peconic Bay, where he learned to love boating, fishing, and water skiing. By the time Freddie was a teenager, he knew what his future held, and he knew what his father expected of him. He also knew that he wasn't measuring up. His friends noticed that their usually laid-back and fun-loving friend became anxious and self-conscious around Fred, whom Freddie and his friends called the Old Man. Solidly built and standing 6'1", Fred was an imposing figure with hair slicked back from a receding hairline, who rarely wore anything but a well-tailored three-piece suit. He was stiff and formal around kids. He never played ball or games of any kind with them, and it seemed as if he had never been young. If the boys were tossing a ball around in the basement, the sound of the garage door opening was enough to cause Freddie to freeze. "Stop, my dad's home." When Fred came into the room, the boys had the impulse to stand and salute him. "So what's this?" he'd ask as he shook his boy's hand. "Nothing, Dad," Freddie would say. "Everybody's getting ready to leave soon." Freddie remained quiet and on high alert as long as the old man was home. In his early teens, Freddie started lying to his father about his life outside the house to avoid the mockery or disapproval he knew the truth would bring down on him. He lied about what he and his friends got up to after school. He lied about smoking, a habit Mary Ann had introduced him to when he was 12 and she was 13. Telling his father that he was going around the corner to help his best friend, Billy Drake, walk a non-existent dog. Fred, for instance, wasn't going to find out that Freddie and his buddy Homer from St. Paul's School had stolen a hearse for a joyride. Before returning the vehicle to the funeral home, Freddie pulled into a gas station to fill up the tank. As he got out of the car and walked toward the pump, Homer, who was lying down in the back to see what it was like, sat up. A man at the pump across from them, thinking he'd just seen a corpse rising from the dead, screamed, and Freddie and Homer laughed until they cried. Freddie lived for that kind of prank, but he regaled his brothers and sisters with his exploits only if his father wasn't home. For some of the Trump kids, lying was a way of life, and for Fred's oldest son, lying was defensive. Not simply a way to circumvent his father's disapproval or to avoid punishment, as it was for the others, but a way to survive. Mary Ann, for instance, never went against her father, perhaps out of fear of an ordinary punishment such as being grounded or sent to her room. For Donald, lying was primarily a mode of self-aggrandizement, meant to convince other people he was better than he actually was. For Freddie, the consequences of going against his father were totally different, not only in degree but in kind. So lying became his only defense against his father's attempts to suppress his natural sense of humor, sense of adventure, and sensitivity. Peele's idea about inferiority complexes helped shape Fred's harsh judgment about Freddie, while also allowing him to evade taking responsibility for any of his children. Weakness was perhaps the greatest sin of all, and Fred worried that Freddie was more like his own brother John, the MIT professor, soft and, though not unambitious, interested in the wrong things, such as engineering and physics, which Fred found esoteric and unimportant. Such softness was unthinkable in his namesake, and by the time the family had moved into the house, when Freddie was 10, Fred had already determined to toughen him up. Like most people who aren't paying attention to where they're going, however, he overcorrected. "That's stupid," Fred said whenever Freddie expressed a desire to get a pet or play a practical joke. "What do you want to do that for?" Fred said with such contempt in his voice that it made Freddie flinch, which only annoyed Fred more. Fred hated it when his oldest son screwed up or failed to intuit what was required of him. But he hated it even more after being taken to task. Freddie apologized. "Sorry, Dad." Fred would mock him. Fred wanted his oldest son to be a killer, in his parlance, for what reason it's impossible to say. Collecting rent in Coney Island wasn't exactly a high-risk endeavor in the 1950s, and he was temperamentally the opposite of that. Being a killer was really code for being invulnerable. Although Fred didn't seem to feel anything about his father's death, the suddenness of it had taken him by surprise and knocked him off balance. Years later, when discussing it, he said, "Then he died, just like that. It just didn't seem real. I wasn't that upset. You know how kids are. But I got upset watching my mother crying and being so sad. It was seeing her that made me feel bad, not my own feelings about what had happened." The loss, in other words, had made him feel vulnerable, not because of his own feelings, but because of his mother's feelings, which he likely felt were being imposed on him, especially as he did not share them. That imposition must have been very painful. In that moment, he wasn't the center of the universe, and that was unacceptable. Going forward, he refused to acknowledge or feel loss. I never heard him or anyone else in my family speak about my great-grandfather. As far as Fred was concerned, he was able to move on because nothing particularly important had been lost. Subscribing as Fred did to Norman Vincent Peale's idea about human failings, he didn't grasp that by ridiculing and questioning Freddie, he was creating a situation in which low self-esteem was almost inevitable. Fred was simultaneously telling his son that he had to be an unqualified success and that he never could be. So Freddie existed in a system that was all punishment, no reward. The other children, especially Donald, couldn't have helped but notice. The situation was somewhat different for Donald. With the benefit of a 7.5-year age difference, he had plenty of time to learn from watching Fred humiliate his older brother and Freddie's resulting shame. The lesson he learned, at its simplest, was that it was wrong to be like Freddie. Fred didn't respect his oldest son, so neither would Donald. Fred thought Freddie was weak, and therefore so did Donald. It would take a long time before the two brothers, in very different ways, came to adapt themselves to the truth of this. It's difficult to understand what goes on in any family, perhaps hardest of all for the people in it. Regardless of how a parent treats a child, it's almost impossible for that child to believe that parent means them any harm. It was easier for Freddie to think that his father had his son's best interest at heart and that he, Freddie, was the problem. In other words, protecting his love for his father was more important than protecting himself from his father's abuse. Donald would have taken his father's treatment of his brother at face value. Dad's not trying to hurt Freddie, he's only trying to teach us how to be real men, and Freddie's failing. Abuse can be quiet and insidious just as often as, or more often than, it is loud and violent. As far as I know, my grandfather wasn't a physically violent man or even a particularly angry one. He didn't have to be. He expected to get what he wanted and almost always did. It wasn't his inability to fix his oldest son that infuriated him. It was the fact that Freddie simply wasn't what he wanted him to be. Fred dismantled his oldest son by devaluing and degrading every aspect of his personality and his natural abilities until all that was left was self-recrimination and a desperate need to please a man who had no use for him. The only reason Donald escaped the same fate is that his personality served his father's purpose. That's what sociopaths do. They co-opt others and use them toward their own ends, ruthlessly and efficiently, with no tolerance for dissent or resistance. Fred destroyed Donald too, but not by snuffing him out as he did Freddie. Instead, he short-circuited Donald's ability to develop and experience the entire spectrum of human emotion. By limiting Donald's access to his own feelings and rendering many of them unacceptable, Fred perverted his son's perception of the world and damaged his ability to live in it. His capacity to be his own person, rather than extension of his father's ambitions, became severely limited. The implications of that limitation became clearer when Donald entered school. Neither of his parents had interacted with him in a way that helped him make any sense of his world, which contributed to his inability to get along with other people and remained a constant buffer between him and his siblings. It also made reading social cues extremely difficult, if not impossible, for him, a problem he still has to this day. Ideally, the rules at home reflect the rules of society, so when children go out into the world, they generally know how to behave. When kids go to school, they're supposed to know that they shouldn't take other children's toys and they're not supposed to hit or tease other children. Donald didn't understand any of that because the rules in the house, at least as they applied to the boys, be tough at all costs. Lying is okay. Admitting you're wrong or apologizing is weakness, clashed with the rules he encountered at school. Fred's fundamental beliefs about how the world worked in life, there can be only one winner and everybody else is a loser, an idea that essentially precluded the ability to share, and kindness is weakness, were clear. So I guess the phrase, a high tide raises all boats, wouldn't go very far in a Trump household. Good to know. Donald knew because he had seen it with Freddie. That failure to comply with his father's rules was punished by severe and often public humiliation, so he continued to adhere to them even outside his father's purview. Not surprisingly, his understanding of right and wrong would clash with the lessons taught in most elementary schools. Donald's growing arrogance, in part a defense against his feelings of abandonment and an antidote to his lack of self-esteem, served as a protective cover for his deepening insecurities. As a result, he was able to keep most people at arm's length. It was easier for him that way. Life in the house made all the children in one way or another uncomfortable with emotions, either expressing them or being confronted with them. It was probably worse for the boys, for whom the acceptable range of human feeling was extremely narrow. I never saw any man in my family cry or express affection for one another in any way other than the handshake that opened and closed any encounter. Getting close to other children or authority figures may have felt like a dangerous betrayal of his father. Nonetheless, Donald's display of confidence, his belief that society's rules didn't apply to him, and his exaggerated display of self-worth drew some people to him. A large minority of people still confuse his arrogance for strength, his false bravado for accomplishment, and his superficial interest in them for charisma. Donald had discovered early on how easy it was to get under Robert's pale skin and push him past his limits. It was a game he never tired of playing. Nobody else would have bothered. Robert was so skinny and quiet that there was no sport in tormenting him, but Donald enjoyed flexing his power even if it was only over his younger, smaller, and even thinner-skinned brother. Once, out of frustration and helplessness, Robert kicked a hole in the bathroom door, which got him into trouble despite the fact that Donald had driven him to do it. When his mother told Donald to stop it, he didn't. When Mary Ann and Freddie told him to stop, he didn't. One Christmas, the boys received 3 Tonka trucks, which soon became Robert's favorite toys. As soon as Donald figured that out, he started hiding them from his little brother and pretending he had no idea where they were. The last time it happened, when Robert's tantrum spiraled out of control, Donald threatened to dismantle the trucks in front of him if he didn't stop crying. God, I just want to punch this man in the face. Punch him. Hard. Even baby Donald. How do you make me mad at baby Donald? Deep breath. Desperate to save them, Robert ran to his mother. Mary's solution was to hide the trucks in the attic. I don't want to punch that frickin' bitch in the face. The mother's solution was to hide the trucks in the attic, effectively punishing Robert, who'd done nothing wrong, and leaving Donald feeling invincible. He wasn't yet being rewarded for selfishness, obstinacy, or cruelty, but he wasn't being punished for those flaws either. No shit. I don't know why that just made me so mad. Please tell me that that made you mad. If it didn't, I don't know if we can be friends anymore. Just kidding. Love you all. Mary remained a bystander. She didn't intervene in the moment and didn't comfort her son, acting as if it weren't her place to do so. Even for the 1950s, the family was split deeply along gender lines. Despite the fact that Fred's mother had been his partner, she had literally started his business. It's clear that Fred and his wife were never partners. The girls were her purview, the boys were his. When Mary made her annual trip home to the Isle of Lewis, only Mary Ann and Elizabeth accompanied her. Mary cooked the boys' meals and laundered their clothes, but didn't feel that it was her place to guide them. She rarely interacted with the boys' friends, and her relationship with her sons, already marred by their early experiences with her, became increasingly distant. When Freddie at 14 dumped a bowl of mashed potatoes on his then 7-year-old brother's head, it wounded Donald's pride so deeply that he'd still be bothered by it when Mary Ann brought it up in her toast at the White House birthday dinner in 2017. The incident wasn't a big deal, or it shouldn't have been. Donald had been tormenting Robert again, and nobody could get him to stop. Even at 7, he felt no need to listen to his mother, who, having failed to heal the rift between them after her illness, he treated with contempt. Finally, Robert's crying and Donald's needling became too much, and in a moment of improvised expedience that would become the family's legend, Freddie picked up the first thing at hand that wouldn't cause any real damage, the bowl of mashed potatoes. Everybody laughed, and they couldn't stop laughing, and they were laughing at Donald. It was the first time Donald had been humiliated by someone he even then believed to be beneath him. He hadn't understood that humiliation was a weapon that could be wielded by only one person in a fight. That Freddie, of all people, could drag him into a world where humiliation could happen to him made it so much worse. From then on, he would never allow himself to feel feeling again. From then on, he would wield the weapon, never be at the sharp end of it. And actually, thus concludes Chapter 2, folks. We are 17% complete. Hopefully tomorrow will be a slightly cooler day, although I do not expect it at this point, so I can take at least part of this outside. As lovely as the weird celery lighting in here is, I'm sure that you would all appreciate a little bit of sunshine, touch trees. At least I would. If I'm going to read this bullshit out loud, I want it to be silly. Alright, folks, stay sane out there, and, as always, try and avoid the news.